So in the last video for lesson 5.1, we talked about percentages and how we're going to be using them in math problems. And about how a percentage by itself cannot be used in a math problem. I have to either change it into a fraction or I have to change it into a decimal. So today's lesson is how do I take this percent and change it into the fraction, such as 25% is the same as 1/4, or the decimal, the 25% is 25 hundredths. So as we get into this lesson, I want you to remember the most important thing, that when I'm talking about percents, I'm always talking about any number that's given as the percent written over a denominator of 100. That's how all of these will be set up to begin with. So if we get that down, the rest of this becomes really easy. This is, once again, a short video. It's not complicated. It's not difficult. Make sure you're following along. Make sure you're taking your notes. Make sure you pause the video to keep up. Make sure you rewatch it if you aren't quite sure or aren't quite understanding it. And then, when you do all those things, put forth that effort, if you're still not getting it, come to me and I'm more than happy to help. When we get into this then, we're talking about writing percents as fractions and decimals. And we look at the information that's given. Notice we have our grid of 10 by 10 once again. When I look at my percents then, I'm going to process through when I think about using out of 100. Now I said in the last video that all of our charts were really nice on that video because they totaled 100. But you should notice that in orange, I already have 113%. So that's more than 100. So I'm going to have to look at what that's telling me and how to set them up. So instead of going in and filling in a whole bunch of grids constantly, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use the math of setting everything up over 100 and then moving forward with that. We're also going to be talking about how we're going to reduce all of our answers when they are in the fraction form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I look at my percent that I'm starting with. So one of the things I showed you in the last video was that when I'm given the percent, in this case we're talking about 15%, or the banana that contains 15% of our vitamin C, that I just take the percent itself and I write it over 100. So anytime, once again, I have my percent, I know it goes over 100 when I'm doing it in the fraction form. So in the fraction form, it starts out as 15 over 100, and now we got to focus in on what we learned back all the way in chapter 1. Any fraction that is written, I got to see if I can reduce it. And in this case, I can indeed reduce it. What would I reduce it by? So hopefully you notice our divisibility rules from chapter 1, that it ends with zeros and fives, so 5 will go into both of them. So when I look at it reducing then, 5 is the only number actually that will go into both numbers. So I will reduce by 5, and that's going to leave me with 3 out of 20. So I know that my 15% is the same thing, fraction form, as 3/20. On B then, it says to also write the 113% as a fraction. Now notice, they give me a whole grid and a second whole grid. Why do I have two of them? Well, I have two of them because it's over 100%. So I know I filled up one whole complete grid. And therefore, when I go over my percentage, I have to have a second one to show what else is left. Mathematically, all I do is take the percent that's given and write it as my numerator. So, oh, that was 100. Sorry, I messed up on that because they had the 13 over there. So I knew that I had my 100 and then I'm adding my 13 to it. But that does give me my 1 whole plus 13 100ths, which is 113%. I jumped ahead of myself because what I was going to show you is if I have my 113 over 100, I can't reduce that. There isn't anything that's going to go into 3 or 113 because 3 plus 1 and 1 makes 5. Well, 3 doesn't go into 5 evenly. 9 doesn't work. It's not even. They don't both end with zeros and fives. That's all my divisibility rules that I use on a regular basis. But I can do what? I can convert it, right? Because any fraction is division. So I take my top number divided by 100. And when I take my numerator divided by my denominator, I see that 100 goes into 113 one time, which is indeed 100 and a remainder of 13. And then, same process as we did in Unit 1, my remainder is my numerator, my divisor is my denominator. So by just taking my percent and putting it over 100, which takes me down to here, I get the same thing as thinking about a grid, one complete grid being 1, and the 13 100ths is left over. No matter which way I approach the problem, I'm still going to get 1 and 13 100ths as my answer. And then the last one that they have you look at was a decimal point. So when we looked at the third item on the chart, then we had 0.5%. Wow, we don't usually use 0.5% on a regular basis, but we can have 0.5%. It is quite possible. So once again, we're going to take that percent and write it as my numerator. Now here's where it does get a little tricky. One of the ways that you can look at it is, well, I have a 0.5, so I don't want to have a decimal point in my numerator. And there's only one decimal position. So if I multiply each of those by 10, that moves my decimal point over one space. So by multiplying by 10, I know I'm going to move it to the right to give me 5. And multiplying by 10 moves it to the right. It's at the end of the 100, so I get 1,000. So I can see that 5 1,000ths is the same thing as 0.5 over 100, or 5/10 over 100. But I still can't use that because I have to reduce, don't I? So when I look at that, and I have my 5/10 as my numerator, I'm also going to look at that I can reduce. Notice I circled these directions because it tells me that I have to have it in my simplest form. So when I reduce both of those by 5s, I see that my numerator is going to be left with 1, and therefore 1,000 divided by 5 gives me a denominator of 200. The other way that I can look at that is by looking at my original fraction form of 5/10 over 100. And once again, mathematically, that means to do what? It means to divide. And which one goes inside my division box? The 5/10. So if I divide by my denominator, then I have to ask, can I divide a decimal by a whole number? Yeah, I can. I just have to raise up my decimal. And then when I look at it, well, I have 100 going into 5. No, it won't do that, will it? So I'm going to add a 0. 100 going into 50. It won't do that either. So I'm going to add a 0. And 100 going to 500. It will do that. And how do I say that number? Well, when it comes to my decimal point positions, once again, I start from my decimal point, and I have tenths, hundredths, thousandths. That is said, 5,000ths. I'm going to run out of space. And so I write it in the fraction form of 5,000ths. Notice what we have here. So we could divide and get to the point where I have 5 1,000ths, or I could multiply each of them by 10 to get 5 1,000ths. I don't care which way you do it, honestly, as long as you're able to be successful at it and repeat the process over and over and over again. So either way that you get to, you should get to a point where you have 5 1,000ths as your answer, and then, once again, back to the directions, it tells me to reduce down to the simplest form, so I would divide each of them by 5, and I know that my 5/10 of a percent or half of a percent is the same thing in fraction form as 1/200. Then that we go on to the bottom question underneath that page that says explain why two 10 by 10 grids were used to show 113%. That's what I explained here just a moment ago. I have two grids that were needed because the percent is over 100% and one can only hold 100. So if I know that I have more than 100% and I have to grid it, I'm going to have more than one grid. If I have 270%, then I'd have to have two whole grids and a third one to indicate the 70. If you need to pause the video, please pause it now. Finish writing down this note so you know how to explain why we had to use it, and then start the video back up, move on to the next slide. So now we're going to look at how we change these into decimals. Now some of you, it'll be a little easier because you know how to say the fraction and what that would look like as the decimal. Okay? Some of us, we're just going to have to divide it out. So when I look at my percent, once again, same steps, I take my percent and I put it over 100. So my 72 over 100 is always going to be the way I start. Now how do I say that? I say that as 72 hundredths. If I say it as 72 hundredths, as they have written in the directions, then I just write that as a decimal as 0.72 because that says 72 hundredths. Some of us are still struggling with our place value. So my best advice that I can give you is to learn your place value because it's something you're going to have to know for 6th grade beyond. I mean, we're talking all the way through college that you have to know your decimal point place value. But it's also something that's on the I step that you have to recognize. The biggest thing is it's going to make your life easier if you just know what your place values are. But mathematically, if you don't and you're still struggling with that, this is still what type of math? It's still division. And I'm still going to divide my numerator by my denominator. And when I look at doing that then, I know that I have to have a decimal point behind my 72 because we're changing it into decimals. And then I have a decimal divided by a whole number. I bring my decimal point up. And then I can't take 100 into 7. I can't take 100 into 72. So I add a 0 and now I have 720. 100 does go into that 7 times, which is 700. And a remainder of 20. And then I add a 0 and bring it down. 2. It's the same thing. So I know that I can either say it as a fraction and recognize it and write it down, or I can do the division and I'm still going to get to the same answer. Either way, it's up to you. I put it in there typed out in case you have trouble reading my numbers when I'm writing it out, but it's still going to show you the same process. Bring up my decimal, divide by 100, I'm still going to get this as 72 hundredths or 0.72. On B then, it says to also write this one as a decimal, and I have 4%, and 4% is 4 over 100. I take my percent, write it as my numerator, and then this one doesn't show me to say it and write it out. This one shows me to go ahead and divide. So when I divide this one, I bring up my decimal, and I take 100, doesn't go into 4. 100 goes into 40. No, it doesn't. It's a 0, isn't it? So 100 goes into 400 4 times. And when they show you all of these steps, they're showing you step by step what you would have done to get to the 0.04 or 4 hundredths. When I write this one, wow, they give me a decimal to start with, 25 and 81 100ths. So in 25 and 81 100ths, the best thing that I can do is to divide. Well, let's divide. If I take 25 and 81 100ths, divide it by 1, I bring up my decimal, and I divide out. And with each step that I divide out, I end up with 0.2581. But maybe the best thing to do would be to read the directions. To divide by 100, move the decimal point 2 places to the left. We've talked about that, haven't we? That's that shortcut that I mentioned all the way back in Unit 1. That when I divide by a 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, so on and so forth, I count the number of zeros, and dividing means I get smaller. I move left. If it was multiplication, I would move right, the same number of spaces. So when I count my decimal spaces and move left, 1, 2, without having to do all that division, this shows me that I know what I'm doing and this is my work. So you get credit if you show me that, instead of having to do all this. If you don't show me that, I need to see this in your book and on your papers for your homework. But I still get to 2581. So that is said 2,581 10,000ths. So then my last ones that I'm going to look at, I'm going to go to a fraction, I'm going to go to a decimal. So when I talk about my 80%, I take my 80, I put it over 100. And once I have my 80 over 100, what am I going to do? I'm going to reduce, right? So when I reduce, I can cross out my zeros because they both end with zeros. That's a quicker step. And that leaves me with 8/10. And then I could divide by 2. And that leaves me with 2 goes into 8 4 times, and 2 goes into 10 5 times. So I know that 80% is the same thing as 4/5. When I have my 150, I take my numerator, or my percent, and write it as my numerator, and put it over 100. Well, once again, I end with zeros, so I can reduce by zeros. And then I can, 10 and 15, I can reduce by 5. And that gives me, well, 3 over 2. Now, when I convert 3 over 2, that is the same as, 1 and 1/2. So 3/2 is the same as 1 and 1/2. When I have 0.2%, I write my percent as my numerator. There's 2 ways I can do it, isn't there? I could divide my decimal point and bring up my decimal point. And then it would go in 0 times. I need a 0. Still goes in 0 times. So I need another 0. And be 2. Right? Or I could multiply by that 10 and see that it's the same thing as 2 1,000ths. And guess what this is called? 2 1,000ths. So that would work as well. Now, when we get to our 2 1,000ths then, I forgot to show this step, 2 1,000ths, then I have to reduce by 2's to give me my 1 over 500 as my reduced fraction. On my last one then, I'm looking at changing them into decimals. So I have 58%, starting at 58 over 100, and I'm going to skip dividing in boxes because if it's easier to do the shortcut, let's do the shortcut. My 58 is always going to have the decimal point behind it because it was a whole number. Division is always going to move to the left, and the number of zeros tells me how many times to move it. There are 2 zeros. So I move it once, move it twice. So I know that it's the same as 0.58 or 58 hundredths, which is exactly what that fraction says. And then in my final one, I have 9%, so 9 over 100, moving my decimal. Well, my decimal's at the end of my whole number. 2 times, always to the left when I'm dividing. Once, run out of decimals or digits, I'm going to move in a 0. So I move it twice. So 9 100ths would be written as 0.09. So just reviewing, when we're talking about percents, we're talking about a number over 100. And when I go from a number over 100, then I have to know how to mathematically divide to get a decimal or reduce that fraction down to its lowest form. So remember that my top number is my numerator. It always goes inside my box. I'm always going to divide by my denominator. If it's easier to show the shortcut by moving that decimal back to the left that many spaces, then please do that. Make sure that you go back and watch the video if you need to. Look at the board for your assignment. Come and ask questions if you have any.